on Sundays, we typically bring letters from priests or bishops or learned lay people or whoever issuing calls to action, chastising bishops, warning the faithful, whatever the topic of the letter is. And today is no different. I have two relatively short pieces from two priests that I have covered here in the past. Monsignor or Father Nicholas Books, who was a theologian who worked in the then Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under Benedict XVI. And the priest we'll cover first, Father Joachim Heimerl, more famous on this channel, I think, for his alternative reading of the St. Malachi prophecy. Many Catholics who, for whatever reason, find comfort in the St. Malachi prophecy because it means they were under the impression that Francis would be the last pope. Well, that hasn't exactly happened yet, so now we're coming up with alternative theories as to why that is. And I have his reading of it twice, actually, on this channel. The short version is he thinks that with counting Francis, there were like 5 or 6 popes left because he went and looked at each individual popes and found that the classic traditional reading of the St. Malachi prophecy actually contains some serious errors. Worth your time if you're interested in that sort of thing. We'll go to Father Joachim Heimerl, whose letter was posted to Marco Tossati's website. Mr. Tossati is an Italian Catholic journalist. He was one of the first to publish Archbishop Vigano's letters going back well before 2018. And he was one who actually was the first to publish Vigano's now infamous testimony that caused an international firestorm back in 2018. The title of the piece is "Let Us Fight for the Traditional Mass and for the Traditional Faith, an Appeal to All Priests and Faithful." So this is not just a correction or something, a private letter between bishops. This is a letter to all faithful and to all priests. There are only a few things worth fighting for. Whether certain state systems or modern ideologies belong to these things is debatable, even if most bishops and the Pope support it. However, among the things worth fighting for are the Catholic faith and its authentic expression in the Holy Mass. However, it is clear that this can only be the Mass that the Church has celebrated since ancient times. However, it is also clear that with the so-called New Mass of Paul VI, the new faith arrived, and this is precisely where the problem lies. Ultimately, the Church was divided over the New Mass and the new faith, as evidenced by the bitter struggle waged against the traditional Mass. No one can be Catholic if he disagrees with the traditional faith and the traditional Mass, if he rejects them, or like Pope Francis, if he even opposes them. And it is this contradiction in itself that is slowly destroying the new Church. But what about those who have remained faithful to the Catholic faith, and therefore to the traditional Mass? Is there really a united fight for the Catholic cause? I wish it were so, but contradictions within the Church have long influenced various groups within the tradition. The confraternities of St. Pio and St. Peter are a symbol of this. One follows the straight and narrow Catholic path. When he says St. Pio, he means the Society of St. Pius X and the Fraternal Society of St. Peter. One follows the straight and narrow Catholic path. The other believes it is imperative to submit to the Pope at all costs, because the Pope is, after all, the Pope, and because one cannot be Catholic without the Pope, a sort of deus in terris. It used to be like that. This is true, but those times are over, at least after the ill-fated pontificate of Francis. Since then, heresy, apostasy, and idolatry have conquered the Church, and instead of fighting for the traditional faith and the traditional Mass, those who are still truly Catholic constantly turn to Rome for permission for what has always been permitted and can never be prohibited, the traditional Mass. Pope Pius V granted it eternal validity, gave it an almost dogmatic character, and bound priests to this form of the Roman rite once and for all. But who would have thought that in the Catholic Church, eternal didn't mean forever? And who would have thought that there was practically no one who dared to challenge a pope who thought he could dispose of the Holy Mass, impose prohibitions on it, and create exceptions, as if he were the sole master of divine worship? Can the most sacred thing really reside in the discretion of a person and his high office? Hardly. And if so, what value would the sacred have then? I must confess, I have a secret soft spot for Martin Luther, but I never thought I'd reveal it in connection with the traditional Mass. My weakness, however, concerns only Luther's most famous phrase, the one he uttered before the emperor of the Diet of Worms. Here I am, I can do nothing else. May God help me. Dear friends of the traditional Holy Mass, dear Catholics in the true sense of the word, when and where do you utter this or a similar phrase and thereby resolutely defend the true Catholic faith? It is not enough to simply tolerate the Roman hatred for the old Mass or to spiritualize it as a necessary evil for the sake of simplicity, because all this does not come from God, but at most from the devil, and it is precisely this that we must resist at all costs. Dear brothers, celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. You do not need any permission to do this because this permission has been granted to you through ordination. Pius V confirmed it, and the history of the church testifies to it. If this isn't enough for you, then nothing is enough. And if we aren't enough, if we fight for the Holy Mass, we will lose every other spiritual battle. We probably all feel it. Within the church, we are engaged in a final battle for the truths of the Catholic faith. That this is a battle for the traditional Mass is obvious, and here it is up to each of us to defend our own position, even if that means asserting ourselves like Luther did at the Diet of Worms. And now I know some people will be upset that he invoked Luther, but it is what it is. That one phrase of Luther's is not exactly inaccurate. It was just Luther was wrong when he said it. Not because the statement itself is wrong, but because of what he was doing when he invoked it. And I'm going to show you, before we get to the second letter, bit of news. This should raise some eyebrows. I don't think the Eastern Masses or the Eastern Liturgy is under threat yet, but I have always said that once they've gotten done with what they're going to do to the traditional Mass, and I'm not one who thinks all these exemptions and exceptions are from Leo are going to amount to much, that eventually they would turn towards the Novus Ordo and strip it of all of its reverence and beauty and allow clown masses to flourish, and then they turn their eyes to the East. So John Henry Weston broke this. He has a screenshot here from the Vatican's website that shows the daily events. It says Arthur Roach, the cardinal who opposes the traditional Latin Mass at every turn, has been appointed to the dicastery for Eastern churches. I guess they want to see if he can't harm another traditional rite. Well, see, here's the thing. The only error Mr. Weston makes is this is not another traditional rite. This is like a dozen traditional rites or something. Because in the East, you have the rite of St. Charbel, you have the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and several others. So, again, he is now going to be on the dicastery for the Eastern churches. Wonderful. Who better than someone who sowed the most chaos in the church than him? Pray for the Eastern churches. The Eastern Catholic churches are just as Catholic as those of us in the Latin West. Let's not forget them. Let's remember they are Catholic and they deserve our prayers and our respect too. With that, turn to Monsignor Books here, who was published by Mr. Edward Penton on his Substack. Mr. Penton is a Catholic journalist for like National Catholic Register and a few other things, EWTN and the like. His headline, Father Bucks to Cardinal Cupich, the liturgy must elevate us to divine truth and beauty. Father Nicola Bucks writes an open letter to Cardinal Cupich, critical of his recent public criticism of the traditional Latin Mass. Now, for those of you who don't know what that criticism was, Cardinal Cupich called it a spectacle, a pot meat kettle, right? Like many of the Novus Ordo Masses, not all of them, certainly there are plenty of good priests who offer the traditional Mass, or the new Mass rather, as if they believed that Christ was truly present there and that they were representing the sacrifice at Calvary. There are plenty of priests who do that. But all the liturgical abuse we see in the church today is not in the traditional form. It's always in the Novus Ordo, always. He's not talking about them. Here's what he has to say. By the way, if you don't know who he was a liturgical expert and former consultor to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. There's a letter. It's not terribly long. To His Eminence, Cardinal Blaise Cupich, your most reverend eminence. Quote, for I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. See 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 9. This statement of the apostle describes the identity of Christianity, both as the proclamation of the gospel and as the church's public worship. Focusing on the latter, it can rightly be said that the liturgy is the spectacle offered to the world by those who adore Christ, the one Lord of the cosmos and of history, to whom they belong and not to the world. This is recalled by the expression liturgical service, which is truly appropriate, unlike the term animation, now in vogue, as if worship were not already animated by Jesus Christ and by the Holy Spirit. After the persecutions, this became evident because Christians did not burn incense to the Roman emperor, but to Jesus, the Son of God. Catholic liturgy, therefore, has regal and imperial characteristics. Eastern liturgies teach us this because worship of God stands in opposition to any worship of the worldly rulers of the moment. It is untrue that the Second Vatican Council desired a poor liturgy, since it asks that, quote, rites should shine with noble simplicity. See the Constitution on the Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, paragraph 34. Because they must speak of the majesty of God, who is noble beauty itself, and not of worldly banalities. The Church understood this from the beginning, both in East and West. Even St. Francis prescribed that the most precious linens and vessels be used in worship. What then is the participation of the faithful, if not to be part of and to take part in the spectacle of a faith that affirms God and therefore challenges the world and its profane spectacles, which are indeed spectacular? Think of mega conferences and rock concerts. The liturgy expresses the sacred, that is, the presence of God. It is not a theatrical performance. The participation desired by the last council must be full, conscious, active, and fruitful. That is a mystagogy, an entry into the mystery that takes place per preces et ritus, through prayers and rites, which, as St. Thomas reminds us, must elevate us as much as possible to divine truth and beauty. Quantum potest tantum aude, or in the words of then Father Robert F. Prevost, quote, our mission is to introduce people to the nature of the mystery as an antidote to the spectacle. Consequently, evangelization in the modern world must find adequate means to reorient the public's attention, shifting it from spectacle toward mystery. See an address given by the now Pope on May 11th, 2012. The usus antiquor of the Roman Rite performs this function. Otherwise, it could not have withstood the secularization of the sacred that entered into the Roman liturgy, to the point of making people believe that the council itself wanted it. This is the identity and mission of the Church. Finally, Your Eminence, I invite you to consider that the liturgy, since ancient times, was solemn in order to convert many to the faith. And for this reason, it must also have an apologetic value and not imitate the fashions of the world, as St. Cyprian reminds us, up to the deformations at the limit of the bearable that entered the Novus Ordo, as Benedict XVI observed. He's here referring to applause, dances, etc. Do not ever applaud after Mass, please. If you want to say something about the homily, tell it to the priest afterwards personally. I've done that. There's nothing wrong with saying, that was a great homily. Or going up to the cantor after Mass and saying, wow, that was amazing, after Mass. But don't applaud. Please don't dance at the Mass. And I've seen all these things in person before. This is the authenticity of the sacred liturgy. This is the ars celebrandi, as demonstrated by the offertory of the Mass, which is performed for the needs of worship and for the poor. Therefore, Your Eminence, I ask you to engage in a synodal dialogue for the good of ecclesial unity. Nicely done, Father Bucks. In the Lord Jesus, Father Nicola Bucks. I always appreciate when somebody from the broader side of the sane side of things in the church invokes synodal dialogue in a way to annoy the other side. I always approve of that. Maybe that's petty on my part. I don't know. But this is a more moderate take than Father Heimerl's. I would tell you, though, if the Novus Ordo Mass, if the new Mass was offered where the standard Mass was the Reverent Mass, nobody called it the Unicorn Mass because all of them were by default reverent, and those that were not offered reverently, priests had a habit of offering them sloppily and turning them into clown shows, they'd be punished. There would not be much of a traditional movement today. I can tell you that. It would be pretty small, much smaller than it is. And there wouldn't be nearly as many questions about validity and all this other stuff. That's the simple truth. That's where we are today. But that's not the norm. And it still won't be the norm. Despite both Francis and now Leo continuing what Benedict said, which is the new Mass should be offered reverently, like it's the Mass. You should treat it as a sacred thing. But I'm very curious what you think about this. We, on Sunday, also keep these things short for obvious reasons. No clapping for me unless it's a song of praise. Is this acceptable? I would still. I hate contemporary liturgical music. I just do. Like all the contemporary music that you hear is awful. All of it. Fine to listen to if on your own time if you like that stuff, but the Oregon Catholic Press is a terrible, terrible book, and I do not understand why Archbishop Sample tolerates it. Patty says there would still be a question of validity because the right of holy orders change. Yeah, I know, but that would also be a fringe. It would be a fringe consideration. Actually, it is still widely considered a fringe consideration, but nobody would take it seriously if it was offered as if the priest believed what they were doing. The reason people actually entertain the validity of ordination and all the rest of it is because the priests don't act like they're Catholic priests at the altar. Oftentimes, not all of them, certainly not all of them, but plenty of them do that. Or they, right around Halloween, start decorating their parishes with Day of the Dead stuff. I actually have met priests who were ordained by Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Weird to encounter them after he was elected Pope Francis, but hey, whatever. Who were very conservative in their outlook and warned Americans. They were traveling through the United States and they were completely flabbergasted by the Day of the Dead stuff. They're like, no, this is pagan. Don't do this. You wouldn't expect that from somebody from there, ordained by who they were ordained by, but they were. And all these things make it so people will entertain the arguments that the holy orders and the new form of confession and all the rest of it aren't valid because they don't offer the Mass, which is the touch point for most Catholics with the sacraments is Mass and confession, and they don't treat them as if they're serious things. That's why. You treat those like they're serious things, you could take the air out of the traditionalist movement pretty quickly, especially if you then coupled that with actually teaching the Catholic faith, Catholic morality. You would do that and the traditionalist movement would collapse on itself. But they can't do that. Now, can they? Curious what you think of this, so let me know in the comments. I will post both of these links here in a minute to my to the Anthony Stine Substack if you really want to read them for yourself. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. So like and subscribe. If you haven't, it does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. I'm recording this or broadcasting this here just a few days before Thanksgiving in the United States. I will be live streaming on that morning for those of you who are curious. I will be, so don't worry about that. But please pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.